Now, however, the industries were going very fast. In the 90s, Chinese became the fastest expander in the world, and today, of course, they're about to buy up the whole of the United States. So that situation, and they will, if the savings rate, as Mark said, goes on at the rate at which it's going. And the savings rate going up every year, so in India too. I just recently saw how quickly the savings rate has jumped up. But here's one thing I will come back to about what's happening in India, but let me discuss the Chinese thing a little bit more. So they did this wonderful thing in agriculture, pretty good things in industry. And in healthcare, that's one morning, since the market economy works better, one morning they went from a Canada-type system to the US-type system, which in this context was not an improvement. And the result, of course, is could be seen in demographic statistics. In this period of highest growth rate, what was happening? The Chinese in 79 had a life expectancy of 68 years. They claim 70, but 68 would be reasonable, I think, on the basis of all the estimates I've seen. And now, with 28 years or 27 years of the fastest growth in the world, they moved that 4 years to 72. Now that is a painfully slow rate of expansion, because 72 is nowhere at the margin of biology in any sense. And if you, even if you compare with India as a whole, which was way behind China, that gap is now halved. Not because India has been doing things terribly well, but it continues to do it in its bungling way. The Chinese introduced a new bit of bungling which they didn't have earlier in 79. Now healthcare was pretty inefficient in many ways and costly, and people tell you stories about how dreadful the therefore doctors were. But the fact is that there was an entitlement to healthcare for all. And now, in fact, the percentage of people who are securely covered by insurance is quite small. And you have to buy your own insurance at your own cost. The Chinese are very aware of it. In this conference that I went to with insurance indication, we did hear the Deputy Minister of Health expressing great concern, which almost sounded like the concerns I was expressing in my speech separately at that time, but I've been doing it for a while, and it was interesting for me to see the Chinese government expressing this at this time, which I'm very hopeful about that. But what did happen actually? The right way of comparing is to think of those parts of India which had similar to China's system, like health insurance for all, like Kerala. Now Kerala at that time, it was 67 when China's life expectancy was 68. Kerala is now close to 76, China is 72. If you look at particular indicators like infant mortality rate, the last numbers I've seen, well, the numbers for 79 is clear, there were 37 per thousand in both Kerala and China. And China now, the last number I saw was 28, I think it was last year's, and Kerala is 12. There is something that Chinese have missed out, despite the fact that the Kerala growth rate, which is not, as often people say, very low, that's not the case. It's faster than the rest of India, really, average. And yet, it's nothing like the Chinese. And yet, the dramatic surge of life expectancy, cut down in infant mortality, child mortality, had a just massive slowdown just when growth was picking up. So while I'm very keen that the Growth Commission, given its job, concentrate on growth in the way that we know it, there are other growths which are central to human development, which have to be brought in by other organizations, maybe Oxford Center and other organizations. That can't be the end of the story. It's part of the story. And it's a huge gap that's missing there, which we have to address. I shouldn't go on too long. Let me quickly move back to the issue that seemed to me to be very central at this time. In both the countries and in the rest of the world, between the two countries, by the way, you've got 40% of the world population, so that in itself, even without any example for any other country, is quite large. I think the issue of the public sector has to be worked out in both countries. In case of China, the whole issue of health delivery is hugely important. Education too. I mean, there have been, if you look at the literacy numbers today, they're not they are higher, but not radically higher. In the Indian case, they continue to move, but the standards are pretty low. And India's problems that have come up are not being addressed. China doesn't have the problem. China didn't have the problem of land reform. They had already done it. China didn't have the problem of relations with the unions, because they didn't have any effective union. One of the results of the Communist Party, led by the unions, coming to office is the demise of all unions immediately. We have known that in every part of the world, and that happened in China too. But you see, in India, unions are a big thing, and you have to work with them, because that is the way the democratic system, as Ken Galbraith would say, with countervailing powers work. And the fact of the matter is, you see, with my Nobel money, I tried to set up two trusts, one in Bangladesh, one in India. The Bangladesh one is concerned with gender mainly. The Indian one concerned with basic education, basic healthcare. And if you look at maids, studying is not that much money. Studying that, one of the things found is just the irresponsibility of the top primary school teachers. Often the highest paid people, because of public sector pay rise, highest paid people in Indian villages, very much at elite, quite often very negligent of schools in which teachers, in which students come mainly from landless laborers and so on. One of the things I'm very hopeful about, because I tried to get the unions to join us, and the starting the West Bengal Primary Teachers Association, I suggested we have a joint meeting. I was completely shameless. I quoted Lenin, I quoted everything I knew about the importance of the responsibility of the unions to the population at large and not to their membership. I even dusted up terms that I knew from the 40s. It's called economism, which is to pursue your own narrow interest and not the national interest. All this stuff, Lenin about the union being like the party, like the vanguard of the people. Well, good stuff, actually. and they are good stuff. They're not just good slogans. I think they're very important things to take into account. And now we have started joint initiatives with the union. And I think I'd like to see a similar thing. I mean, you can't, in the Indian system, first of all, you can't beat them. Secondly, you don't want to beat them. The unions are there for a reason. And I think it's a question of the way to develop democratically, and here there's nothing we can learn from China because the unions don't exist in that form, is to get them incorporated in the process. But for them you have to show it's not just growth that you're looking at. You are looking at a bit of collaboration in what's going to be achieved. So I would say that that's one of the things that I would emphasize, of how to get the different parts of the country moving together. I think one of the things I find, coming back to, I should really wind up in a second, I'll make 2 points. Coming back to India and 1 point about China, in the Indian case, I think they have to think through in a deliberate way, which Indian democracy allows, about what the dynamic sectors, including the IT, but not just pharmaceutical and others, what they can do for the rest of the economy. And not just thinking in terms of profit. They're perfectly willing. One of the peculiar things that came to me is how different the capitalists in IT are compared with the traditional capitalists I know. Mainly because they are all very like Mike and Ian and me. I mean, they've gone to university. They may be entrepreneurs. I was reminded of one of Aristotle's passages when he's discussing that what is this entrepreneurship? There's nothing really very special about it. If academics put their mind to it, they can make a lot of money. To give some example of one of his colleagues, who actually great classicist already at that time, who in fact decides to make some money, and he makes. He buys up some olive. He expects a huge olive harvest, and he buys up all the olive pressing machines and becomes gigantically rich. And Aristotle comes to the conclusion anyone can do it. Academics can always do it. This is part of the justification why in forms of life That is the highest form. And those who would like doing lists of capabilities, which I don't, of course, put that up top, and this is a further proof of that particular thing. But that was a huge, recognition for me of how different these entrepreneurs are to the rest. But I think they have to, so they're willing to think about that. But one of the things I find striking when I go to my village and around them in West Bengal, that even now if you chat with the peasants and small rural producers, there's a huge gap between the prices they can get and the information that already exists. Now, I would have thought internet connections, which you can see in pretty much every village, but it has to be a more deliberate linking up, which allows them to get some kind of understanding of what's going on elsewhere. And there's a model to learn there, which comes from none of those countries, but from very developed countries, namely Italy. But a period I spent in Emilia-Romagna, I was very struck by the fact how small producers can get together into leading a cooperative to get that kind of information, in their case, about what's happening to jute or jute replacement and so forth, packaging materials. And there's a huge role to be addressed. On the Chinese case, and with that I'll stop, I think the whole issue of democracy, of course, will have to come up at some stage. It's already present, as Mike said, in terms of public discussion in the elite, pre-selected community. But that may not be quite adequate because there are a lot of shoes that are pinching in different parts of the economy, and you need a greater involvement. India doesn't have that problem. India has the opposite problem. The problem of being able to get all of them together in a democratic vote to agree on doing things that have to be done. So I think in that respect they're very dissimilar, even though there's so much that there is each of these countries can learn from the other. Well, thank you.